Welcome to this journey through a story full of secrets and shadows. Today we go into the Appalachian Mountains' shadows, where thick fog hides secrets that time wants to keep. Please tell us where you're watching us from now, because this story will take you to a place where morals disappear like smoke in the trees. This video is not real. It was made up for fun. Any similarity to real people, whether they are alive or dead, is purely coincidental. The mountains in Western Virginia have always had a strange feeling about them. People lived in deep valleys and on steep slopes, cut off from the rest of the world. They made their own rules and their own truths. Two sisters became famous for the shadow they cast over everyone who crossed their path, not for heroic deeds, in this place where fog never lifted and silence was deafening. In 1902, Nora and Willa came to McDowell County from a place that no one could find. They didn't talk about their past, their families, or bring letters or pictures with them. They were just two women with piercing eyes and planned silence who rented a private property at the foot of Coal River Mountain. The house was old and made of dark wood that seemed to soak up the sun. It was surrounded by trees so thick that even in the middle of the day, the property was still in the dark. The closest neighbors lived almost 3 kilometers away, but they still felt the unsettling presence of those women. People looked away because of the way Nora moved slowly, and the way Willa watched everything without blinking. They didn't buy much in town, and didn't talk much either. When they walked through the streets of Welch, people stopped talking as if a cold wind had blown. The sisters' land was in a good spot near an old trail that went through the mountains. Merchants and travelers who didn't want to use the main roads used this trail. Back then, a lot of people took different routes to avoid taxes or people looking at them. The trail went right past the wooden fence that marked the sisters' land. This is where everything started to change. Every afternoon, Willa would sit on the porch with a steaming cup in her hands and watch the trail. She watched every movement, every lone traveler, and every cart that slowly made its way up the hill. Nora took care of the garden in the back and kept the house perfectly clean, as if she were expecting guests who never came in a normal way. People first noticed something strange when a fabric merchant told people in the local tavern that the sisters had asked him to dinner. He said that it was unsettling. There was a lot of food and wine, but the conversation was odd, with long pauses and questions that seemed to be probing rather than showing real interest. He left feeling like he had been looked at and analyzed by those two eyes that seemed to see more than what was on the surface. Other travelers said they had similar things happen to them. The sisters were picky about who they let in, only letting people in who were traveling alone, without any witnesses. The inside of the house was oddly decorated, with things that didn't go together, as if each piece had its own story and came from a different place. There were pocket watches on the wall. Rings were put in small velvet boxes. In the corner of the room, there were stacks of leather suitcases. The sisters' reputation grew quietly as the seasons changed. No one directly accused them. Instead, there was a general sense of unease whenever their names came up. Edmund Thatcher, a Civil War veteran, and the county sheriff started to get vague comments about the property. There was nothing solid, just rumors about odd lights at night and the smell of disturbed earth coming from that way when the wind blew from the north. Edmund was a careful investigator who knew how to tell the difference between paranoia and real evidence. He went to the property twice, and both times Nora greeted him with cold politeness, offered him coffee, and answered all of his questions with careful accuracy. It wasn't against the law to be reserved or live alone. The sisters paid their bills, didn't bother anyone, and Edmund had no legal reason to look into it anymore. But there was one thing that bothered him. On his second visit, he saw that the vegetable garden in the back of the house was very fertile, and that the vegetables were growing to be very big. The soil there was dark, almost black, and had just been tilled. Willa smiled for the first time when he asked what made the soil so rich. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said that some soils just hold more nutrients than others. The sisters' story was just getting started, and the mountains held secrets that even the most experienced sheriff couldn't have guessed. The mountains were even quieter in the winter of 1904. The snow covered the trails, making the world look like a white canvas where any movement left marks that couldn't be hidden. It seemed like Nora and Willa thrived in that season, as if the bitter cold and being alone fed something inside them. The smoke from their chimney rose in lazy spirals, visible for miles, a sad light in the white emptiness. During those cold months, not many people went on the back roads, but there were always some who had to. They had to cross the mountains for reasons they didn't want to talk about. Merchants with shady goods, gamblers running away from debts, and men looking for a new start far away from the problems they had left behind. People who wanted to stay hidden could still use the trail in front of the sisters' property. Willa had gotten into the habit of lighting lanterns on the porch at dusk, even when it was below freezing outside. The lights were a silent invitation, a promise of warmth and safety for tired travelers. And it worked. Men would knock on the door, thankful for the unexpected kindness, and happy to find a safe place to stay before night fell completely. It was interesting to watch how the sisters interacted with each other. Nora acted like a good host by serving hot soup and fresh bread, asking questions about the trip, and showing real interest. Willa stayed more reserved, sitting in the chair next to the fireplace and watching everything that was said and done. They made the place feel both friendly and creepy at the same time. The guests saw strange things. There were too many rooms in the house for just 2 people. Things that were left behind suggested that people were no longer there. There was a pocket watch on the table in the living room that still worked. There were a pair of men's boots next to the door, like someone had just taken them off. A walking stick with a polished ivory handle leaning against the wall. When asked about these things, the sisters gave vague answers like family heirlooms, things we found on the property when we bought it, and gifts from travelers who were grateful. The answers were different, but they were always given with the same calm look that gave away nothing. Edmund Thatcher started to see an odd pattern. Some of the men he knew by sight, those who passed through the area from time to time, just stopped coming, not all at once, and not in a way that caught his attention right away, but over the course of months, certain familiar faces stopped going to the local tavern and doing business in nearby towns. When he asked about them, they just shrugged. "They're like that," they said. "They leave without saying goodbye and go their own way." But Edmund kept a notebook where he wrote down names and dates. This was something he had gotten into the habit of doing while he was a police officer. The numbers were starting to add up in a way that couldn't just be a coincidence. At least 8 men he knew personally had talked about plans to cross that trail and then disappeared. He made the decision to visit the sisters' property for the 3rd time, this time without telling them. It was February morning, and the sun was still having trouble breaking through the thick clouds. The house looked even more sad in that soft light, and the windows looked like empty eyes looking out at the gray sky. Nora was polite to him like she always was, but something was different. There was a tension in the air and her shoulders were stiff, which they hadn't been before. Edmund took the coffee that was offered to him and sat in the living room, looking around at the things around him. He asked questions about the winter, the trail conditions, and whether they had seen a lot of travelers lately. Willa walked into the room with firewood for the fireplace, moving slowly and quietly. She carefully stacked the pieces of wood, making sure that each one was in the right place. Then she looked at Edmund, and for the 2nd time, he saw that smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not many travelers lately," she said. "People stay away in the winter. They like the main roads better, even with the taxes and scrutiny." As she talked, Edmund noticed a dark mark on the wooden floor near the fireplace. It looked like something had been spilled and wiped up over and over again, leaving a mark that no amount of scrubbing could completely get rid of. He didn't say anything about it. He just kept that picture in his mind. Edmund said goodbye after a few more minutes of talking. He looked at the back of the property as he left. The vegetable garden was covered in snow, but he could see where the land had been worked on recently, even in the cold. The rectangular sections were arranged with mathematical precision, and they were way too big for a simple subsistence garden. Edmund lit all the candles in his office and opened his notebook that night. He started to plan the routes, the dates, and the names. Absences and silences drew a pattern out of the pages. The sisters' property was right in the middle of that pattern, like a spider in the middle of its web, where need met opportunity. The mountains kept their secrets, but Edmund was determined to pull them out of the frozen ground one by one. That year, spring came late and stayed on the slopes, as if it, too, was afraid of what it might find under the melting snow. The stream's waters rushed through them quickly, taking away the last bits of winter and bringing life back to the valleys. The sisters came out of that season just like they always did, calm and unbothered, with the same calmness that showed in everything they did. During those months, Edmund quietly talked to people who had lived in the area for decades, like old mountain dwellers and people whose families had lived there even before the roads were built. They talked in low voices about the house where Nora and Willa lived, telling him things he didn't know. Even before the sisters moved in, people talked about that house. A hermit lived there years ago. He was a man who stayed away from people and tended to the same garden in the back. He had disappeared without a trace, and the house stayed empty for years until it was sold. Some people said that the land there was cursed because it absorbed things that shouldn't be absorbed. Some people thought these superstitions were funny, but Edmund saw that even those who did laugh didn't want to walk by the property after dark. He needed something real, something that would make a formal investigation necessary. He started to write down everything in a more organized way, going to nearby towns and talking to officials from other counties. He found interesting information in Logan County. A deputy said he had also seen travelers who just vanished from their routes, but he had never been able to put the pieces together. They worked together to map out the smaller trails that ran through that part of the Appalachian. The sisters' land was at a perfect crossroads, where 3 different paths met and then split off in different directions. Anyone who wanted to stay away from the big cities would have to go through there. Edmund made a risky choice in the spring of 1905. He dressed up as a traveling merchant by wearing old clothes and carrying an old suitcase full of useless trinkets. He waited until it was dark and then walked along the path in front of the sisters' house, pretending to be tired and not sure where he would spend the night. The porch lights came on, just like they were supposed to. Willa stood in the doorway and made a gesture that said, "Come in." Edmund agreed and acted like a tired and grateful traveler. The inside of the house stayed the same, but now he looked at everything with trained eyes, looking for things he had missed before. Nora served dinner with the same calm efficiency. The food was simple, but it was well made. The wine tasted like wood and stayed on the tongue. Edmund ate slowly and kept the conversation light, acting like he was just another man passing through who didn't matter or have any connections. He said that he traveled alone, that no one was waiting for him anywhere, and that his life was made up of roads and rented rooms. He saw the sisters' looks at each other. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. A silent message that confirmed something between them. Willa filled his glass again and told him to drink to relax after a long day. Nora said they had a nice guest room and that he could stay the night if he wanted to. The wine made Edmund's eyelids heavy. It wasn't just normal tiredness. It was something deeper and more urgent. He had to leave. He suddenly stood up and said he had forgotten something important in his bag that he needed to get back from the trail where he had left it. His sisters politely asked him not to go, but he was already on his way to the door. The cold night air hit him like a slap, and it instantly cleared his mind. He walked quickly down the path, feeling the sister's eyes on his back through the window. He didn't look back until he was completely hidden among the trees and out of sight. Then he watched the house from a distance as the lights went out one by one, leaving only the fire in the fireplace visible through the cracks. Edmund met with the district attorney and the Logan County Sheriff in the days that followed. He showed them his notebook, his maps, and his carefully written patterns. But he had to deal with problems. Patterns didn't prove anything. Not being there wasn't a crime. Men went missing all the time in the mountains, either because of accidents, wild animals, or just because they wanted to start over somewhere else. The prosecutor was clear. There was no reason to issue search warrants or make arrests without a body, witnesses, or physical evidence of a crime. Edmund would have to find something more solid, something that would turn doubts into facts that couldn't be disputed. To do that, he would have to enter the property in a way that the sisters didn't expect. He started to make plans by watching how they moved, when they left for town, and when the house seemed empty. The vegetable garden in the back called to him. The dark, too fertile soil in the rectangular sections that looked like they were planned out for a reason. It would be there, buried under layers of dirt that the sisters took such good care of. Summer was coming, which meant longer days and the promise of answers that Edmund was looking for with an obsession-like determination. The wind that blew through the pine trees carried secrets from the mountains, and he was about to listen. The summer heat changed the mountains into a different place. Sounds were louder, and the air smelled strongly of pine trees and wet ground. Edmund watched the sisters' daily lives from a distance for weeks, hiding in the thick plants that surrounded the property. He found out that Nora and Willa went to town every Wednesday morning to get supplies. The trip took at least 3 hours each way. He needed that window. Edmund waited until he saw them go down the path before going up to the house on a Wednesday in July. His heart raced in a strange way, not just because he was nervous, but also because he knew he was about to confirm something awful. When he was alone there, the property felt even more oppressive, as if the boards of the house were looking down on him. He went right to the back, where the vegetable garden was laid out in rows that looked like they had been arranged by the military. There wasn't a single weed in the soil, and the plants were growing quickly in a deep green that looked strange in the bright sun. Edmund had brought a shovel with him, and he picked one of the rectangular sections that had seemed the most suspicious to him while he was watching. He started to dig. The ground gave way easily, as if it had been turned over many times, 30 centimeters, 60 centimeters, 90 centimeters. His shirt got stained with sweat that dripped down his face. He was about to give up when the shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. It was something hard wrapped in rotting fabric. Edmund stopped, and his whole body was tense. He carefully dug away the dirt around it with his hands, revealing the outline of something that confirmed his worst fears. There was no doubt now. That was not a normal garden. The sisters planted more than just vegetables in the field. They also buried the things they didn't want to give to guests. He quickly covered everything again, smoothing the ground so it looked like it hadn't been touched. His hand shook, not because he was scared, but because a cold rage was starting to build up in his chest. How many people had gone through that door? How many people had taken that oddly flavored wine and big meal, thinking they had found kindness in the mountains? Edmund knew he had to do something quickly, but he also knew he had to do it smartly. He needed backup, official witnesses, and the right paperwork. He ran down the mountain and straight to the prosecutor's office in Welch. This time, there was no way to ignore the urgency in his voice. He had found proof. He had the missing evidence in his hands. The prosecutor put together a small but dedicated group. There was also the Logan County Sheriff, 2 of his deputies, and a local doctor who could look at anything they found. The next morning, they would climb the mountain with search warrants and the power to search every inch of that property. But Edmund made a deadly mistake. He didn't realize how much information was out there in those mountains, where secrets spread faster than horses. Someone in the city saw the group gathering and heard bits of their conversation. By the time the sun went down, the news had gotten to the wrong people. That night, Nora and Willa had a visitor. A man they had helped months before. Someone who owed them favors and knew how important it was to stay quiet. He told them what the sheriff was going to do and how the investigation was going to hit them like a storm. The sisters listened in silence, their twin eyes taking in every word with the same cold, calculated look they gave everything else. They didn't freak out, they didn't leave. Instead, they worked in the garden all night, with their shadows moving purposefully between the rows in the moonlight. They dug and redug, moved things around, and cleared the field, changing it into something that would tell a different story. They were experts at hiding things, making the truth disappear like fog in the morning sun. The next morning, when Edmund and his group got to the property, they saw the sisters sitting quietly on the porch, having tea, as if it were just another day. Nora smiled when she saw them, the polite smile that never gave away what she was really thinking. Willa stayed still and watched the group with her usual blank face. The warrant was shown. The sisters didn't put up any fight. They just politely stepped aside while the men got to work. Edmund went straight to the garden, to the same spot where he had dug the day before. With renewed determination, his shovel cut into the ground, digging deep to find what he knew was there. But there was nothing. Just dark, nutrient-rich soil, which is normal. He tried one place, then another. The doctor came over and started digging in different places. The sun was so hot that hours went by. They tore up the garden in their desperate search and found nothing but vegetable roots and regular dirt. Edmund looked at his sisters, who were watching from a distance with calm faces. Willa tilted her head a little, a barely noticeable move that could be seen as either questioning or mocking. Without saying a word, the message was clear. They had won that round. The group left the property feeling frustrated and with a lot of questions that weren't answered. Edmund knew what he had found there, but without proof, his word was just a guess. The sisters, who were very patient and planned everything out perfectly, had gotten rid of any evidence that could have gotten them in trouble. The mountains went back to being quiet, keeping secrets that wouldn't come out. Edmund couldn't get rid of the bad taste in his mouth after losing, no matter how much whiskey he drank. He spent weeks going over every little thing that happened that night and every move he made, trying to figure out what he had done wrong. The answer was clear and painful. He had underestimated the sisters and thought they were just regular opponents when they were something else. Nora and Willa were more sophisticated than anyone he had ever met. They were so patient and calm that every conversation turned into a deadly game of chess. Summer went on, and the mood in the area changed in a small but noticeable way. People started to talk more openly about the sisters' ownership now that the investigation had failed so publicly. Some people defended Nora and Willa, saying they were just lonely women being chased by a sheriff who was too paranoid. People in the town's taverns and shops talked about more and more evil theories, which added to a myth that grew with each conversation. Edmund learned that what people thought of him could hurt him. The more he pushed his suspicions, the more obsessed he seemed, and the less believable he became. The prosecutor made it clear that they wouldn't waste any more time or money on that investigation unless they had solid proof. The sisters were untouchable, not because they were innocent, but because there was no evidence that could be used against them in court. Edmund met a woman named Margaret during this time of frustration. She owned a boarding house in Bramwell, which is 2 days' drive from Welch. After hearing about the failed investigation, she went to see Edmund in person and told him a story that made him more determined. Margaret told him about a guest who had stayed at her boarding house a few months ago. He was a middle-aged man who sold watches and jewelry while he traveled. He had said that he would go through the mountains, right by the trail that went across the sisters' property. Margaret remembered him well because he had a very pretty pocket watch with a gold chain and detailed engravings on the cover. He had proudly shown it off and said it was his most prized possession, something he would never sell. The man left one morning in March and was never seen again. The description of the clock was what made Edmund get up from his chair. Margaret drew the engravings from memory, including the initials on the back and the patterns that were woven together on the lid. Edmund knew that clock right away. He had seen it in the sisters' room, where it was hanging on the wall with other things, like a trophy that wasn't too obvious. But once more he had the same problem. Seeing a watch that looked like his didn't help. The sisters could say they bought it, that they got it as payment for a place to stay, or that they found it on the trail. Edmund needed a different plan, one that would make them mess up and show the truth they were trying so hard to hide. He made the decision to completely change his approach. He would study their behavior and patterns, waiting for an opening if he couldn't look into them directly. Edmund started making maps of not only the travelers who went missing, but also the ones who went through the property and lived to tell the tale. There was also a pattern there, and it took him weeks to figure it out. The sisters were very picky. They didn't ask everyone who walked by on the trail. Only those who met certain requirements were invited. For example, they had to be traveling alone and show that they had resources, valuables, and no one was waiting for them in a certain place. Men who had said they were running away from something, who didn't talk to their families, and who had basically disappeared from the world even before meeting Nora and Willa. Edmund had to admit with disgust that the system was almost perfect. Edmund found something that completely changed the way he thought about things while he was looking into them again. He talked to an old accountant who used to keep track of county property records and found out that the house where the sisters lived had a much longer and darker past than he had thought. In the last 50 years, the property had changed hands at least 7 times, which is a lot for an area where land usually stays in the same families for generations. What was even more interesting was the pattern. Each previous owner had lived alone, away from the community, and had sold the house quickly before leaving the area without leaving a forwarding address. It was like that place drew in a certain kind of person, or changed the people who lived there into something else. Edmund started to wonder if Nora and Willa were really the first people to use that place for bad things, or if they were just following a tradition that had been going on for a long time before they got there. The idea was scary because it made it seem like the problem was bigger and deeper than just 2 criminal women. Maybe that place, the crossroads of hidden mountain trails, had always been a natural trap where human predators could find the best places to hunt. Weeks turned into months, and Edmund kept watch in silence. He couldn't officially look into it, but he could watch, write down what he saw, and wait for the sisters to let their guard down. They were patient, but he could be as well. It was a war of attrition fought in the shadows of the mountains, where each side waited for the other to make the first mistake that would cost them everything. Edmund noticed small changes in the sisters' behavior during this time. They didn't go out as much, seemed more careful, and the porch lanterns weren't lit as often. Maybe they were feeling the stress of always being watched, or maybe they were just waiting for things to calm down before getting back to work. Willa, in particular, seemed more alert, as if she thought someone was watching her all the time. In September 1905, something finally happened. A traveler came to town and asked about the sisters. He was different from the others because he wore nicer clothes and spoke with an accent that made it sound like he had gone to school. He said he was a distant cousin of Willa's and wanted to get in touch with family he had lost touch with. Edmund watched him from a distance and saw that the man asked specific questions about the property, the sisters' daily lives, and how they were seen in the community. His questions sounded rehearsed, like they weren't real. Edmund chose to face him directly and took him to the back of the tavern for a private talk. There, under direct pressure, the visitor's story started to fall apart. He finally admitted that he wasn't related to anyone and that he was really looking for a man who had gone missing after saying he would be in that area. The man who was missing was his business partner and had a lot of important papers and money with him. The visitor had followed the partner's path up to that point, and all the evidence pointed to the trail in front of the sister's house as the last place he could have been. Edmund saw a chance. If he could get this guy to work with him, maybe they could set things up so that the sisters would say something that would get them in trouble. It was risky and depended on things he couldn't completely control, but it was the best chance he'd had in a long time. In the shadows of that tavern, two men came up with a plan. They were both looking for truths that the mountains wouldn't show them. Thomas Whitmore, the man who introduced himself, said he would work with Edmund, but only if certain conditions were met. He wanted to know what had happened to his partner and was willing to take risks that Edmund, as a police officer, couldn't technically approve. There was a thin line between investigation and vigilante justice, but Edmund was so desperate that he was willing to consider options he would have turned down months before. The idea behind the plan was simple, but carrying it out was risky. Thomas would act like a normal traveler who needed a place to stay for the night when he met the sisters. Edmund would stay hidden nearby, watching through the windows and ready to step in at the first sign of real danger. They set up a way to communicate based on where Thomas would put his suitcase on the porch if he needed help right away. The night they chose was a Friday in October, when the mountains were already starting to turn red and gold as autumn painted them. At dusk, Thomas walked along the trail with his body language carefully rehearsed to show that he was tired and weak. Edmund stayed a safe distance behind him and eventually found a spot among the trees where he could see the house clearly. It was expected that the lanterns would light up. Willa came out onto the porch and made that welcoming gesture that had already sealed the fate of so many others. Thomas agreed and played the part of the grateful traveler very well. Edmund saw him go into the house, and the door closed behind him like a mouth eating its next meal. Edmund watched from the shadows between the pine trees through the lit windows. He could see shadows moving, Nora serving dinner, and Thomas sitting at the table and talking animatedly. Everything seemed too normal and friendly, which made him even more nervous. The sisters were experts at making people feel safe until it was too late to get away. It took hours. Edmund fought against the cold that was starting to get through his clothes and the stiffness in his muscles from being still for so long. He saw Thomas take more wine and the conversations go on, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. The suitcase stayed inside the house. There had not been an emergency signal. Edmund saw something strange around midnight. Nora went out the back door with something that looked like tools wrapped in cloth. As she walked to the vegetable garden, Edmund couldn't see her anymore. His heart raced. Was that all? Was it going on at that moment? He moved slowly, trying to get a better view without giving away where he was. But when he finally got to see the garden, he only saw Nora digging what looked like a new flower bed. She was working the soil with careful movements in the dim light of the moon. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that called for action. Edmund went back to where he had been before, feeling confused and angry. Thomas had seen Nora leave the house and asked about her. Willa said in passing that her sister liked to work in the garden at night because it was cooler and the work helped her sleep. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation that also served as a veiled warning, a reminder that they knew he was there watching. Thomas felt a shiver go down his spine. Willa looked at him in a way that made him feel like she could read his mind. He decided to go along with it and casually said that he had heard interesting stories about the house, the sisters who lived there, and travelers who stopped to rest and were never seen again. The silence that followed was so thick that it could have been cut with a knife. Willa kept staring at him without blinking. For the first time since he had come into the house, she didn't smile. Then she spoke in a low, measured voice, saying that the mountains told many stories, most of which were made up by lonely people with vivid imaginations. She went on to say that travelers were naturally unstable beings who were always on the move and rarely stayed in one place long enough to put down roots or leave reliable traces. In that area, people often went missing. They always had been. Wild animals, accidents on dangerous trails, and men who just wanted to start over far away from their debts and responsibilities. The mountains were big and didn't care about what happened to people. Thomas understood that he was being tested. Willa's every word was a test to see how much he really knew and how dangerous he really was. He pulled back, laughing nervously and saying he was just repeating what he heard at the bar. Nothing serious. Willa seemed to accept the retraction, but her eyes stayed cold and calculating. Nora came back from the back, washed her hands in a sink by the door, and then joined them again. She told Thomas that it was late and that he should go to bed. She pointed to a door in the hallway and said, "The guest room is ready." Thomas thanked her and left, taking his suitcase with him and making sure that Edmund could see that there was no emergency signal. Edmund kept watch outside. The house became quiet as the lights went out one by one, leaving only the faint glow of the fireplace. He stayed up all night, his eyes burning with tiredness, and wouldn't let himself sleep while Thomas was in that house. Finally, morning came, and a thick fog covered everything in a white blanket. Edmund saw Thomas come out of the front door and wave to the sisters who were watching from the porch. He walked along the path in a relaxed way, only speeding up when he was completely out of sight of the house. The two men met an hour later in a safe clearing where no one could see them. Thomas was clearly shaken and sweating even though it was cool outside. He talked about his conversation with Willa, the moment when he brought up the disappearances and the tension that was in the air, but there was nothing concrete, no admission, and no evidence that could be used. Edmund realized that he had once again underestimated the sisters. They were too smart and too careful to fall for obvious traps. No matter what they were doing, they planned it out and kept it secret so well that it was almost impossible to catch them in the act. And even worse, they seemed to know they were being watched and tested, but it didn't bother them. They went on with their lives in the same unsettling calm as always. The next day, Thomas left and went back to his city without the answers he was looking for. Edmund was stuck in that never-ending dance with enemies who always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. As autumn went on, the world changed colors, but soon the white of winter would take over. The secrets of the mountains stayed hidden as deeply as they had always been. With a fury that seemed to punish the earth, winter came back to the mountains. It was as if nature itself was restless with the secrets buried beneath the frozen ground. People in the area's taverns knew Edmund well, that crazy sheriff who wouldn't leave the sisters alone. Some people felt sorry for him, while others were angry with him, but no one took him as seriously as they used to. His credibility had worn away like rocks in a stream, and the sisters were almost immune to official investigation. During this dark time, Edmund started to notice changes in himself. The obsession took up not only his time, but also his whole life. He didn't sleep much, and he ate even less. He spent whole nights going over his notebooks, redrawing maps, and looking for connections that may not have existed the way he thought they did. His wife had left months ago because she was tired of the ghosts and suspicions that were always in the air and in their conversations. But Edmund couldn't stop. There was something in the mountains that kept him there. A deep need to tell the truth that he felt deep down in every conversation with Nora and Willa. In his mind, they were no longer just suspects. They had become symbols of something bigger. The crimes that went unpunished and the victims whose stories would never be told. An unexpected event in January 1906 changed everything about the situation. A law firm from Charleston sent a young lawyer named Samuel Preston to the area. He brought papers about an unclaimed inheritance with him and was looking for a man who had been seen traveling through those mountains 2 years before. The man in question was the heir to a large estate, and the company needed to find him or officially declare him dead so that the inheritance could be processed. Edmund could tell right away that Samuel was careful and determined. They ran into each other by chance in the tavern, and Edmund saw this young lawyer as a new chance, a different way to make progress. Samuel followed the law strictly, using legal tools that Edmund did not have. This was different from Thomas, who had been motivated by personal feelings. Edmund told Samuel everything he knew, including his notebooks full of notes, his maps with routes and dates marked on them, and his theories that he had come up with after months of obsessive observation. Samuel paid close attention, asked direct questions, questioned what was being said, and made sure to separate facts from guesses. Edmund needed this kind of critical analysis, someone who could look at his data in a new way. The lawyer found patterns that Edmund had missed because he was so obsessed. He saw that a lot of the missing men had more in common than just being alone and not having enough money. Some of them had talked about carrying important papers, like contracts, deeds, and other things that were worth money and had legal value. This was an important observation because it pointed to a motive other than just stealing. Samuel suggested a different plan. Instead of trying to prove that crimes happened, they should focus on showing that certain people definitely passed through the sisters' property and were never seen again. If they could prove this with enough evidence, they could get an official investigation based on documented disappearances of people with legal ties that could be verified. The two men worked together for weeks, going to nearby towns, talking to shopkeepers, boarding house owners, and anyone else who might have seen or talked to the missing men. Samuel was good at getting people to talk and getting them to remember things they had forgotten or thought weren't important. He built cases the same way he built legal arguments, brick by brick, until the structure was impossible to deny. They found that at least 4 of the missing men had left behind proof that they planned to use that specific trail. This proof included letters sent to friends, entries in guest books that mentioned their destinations, and conversations that were witnessed about their planned routes. These things didn't prove that crimes happened, but they did show a clear pattern in space. All of these men had come together at the same place in the mountains, and then they just disappeared from all records of people. Samuel wrote a formal request to the county court asking for an official investigation into the documented disappearances of people who had legal interests at stake. It was a great idea because it took the emotional side out of the equation and made the problem a legal necessity. The court could not ignore real requests about inheritances and property without at least looking into them. In February, the petition was accepted, and a judge chose 2 independent investigators to look into the case. Edmund felt something he hadn't felt in months, a glimmer of hope that things would finally get better. But there was also fear because the sisters had already shown that they were very good at making evidence disappear. What else could they have kept from us during all those months of constant stress? The men who were chosen to investigate were from outside the area and had no ties to it or any biases against it. They got there in March, when the snow was starting to melt, and the first signs of spring were showing up as green patches among the white. Edmund met them and gave them all of his papers, but he stayed away from the active investigation because he knew that being there could make things worse because of his past with the sisters. The investigators talked to a lot of people in the community who had anything to do with Nora and Willa. These talks painted a complicated and contradictory picture. Some people said that the sisters were just quiet and innocent victims of an obsessed sheriff's unfair treatment. Others whispered about their feelings of unease and that gut feeling that something was very wrong with that property. The investigators finally went to see Nora and Willa on a rainy April afternoon. Edmund watched from a distance as the sisters greeted the men with the same cold politeness they used for all official visits. The meeting went on for hours, and when the investigators finally left, their faces were carefully blank, showing nothing about what they had found or what they thought. The judge got the official report 2 weeks later. Edmund gained access to the document through Samuel, reading each word with a mixture of hope and dread. It was annoying how carefully neutral the report was. The investigators admitted that there was an unusual pattern of disappearances in that area, but they didn't find any physical proof of crimes. The vegetable garden and other parts of the property had been searched, but nothing that could be used against them had been found. But, and this was very important, the report did not completely clear the sisters. It just said that there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone with a crime right now, but it did suggest that the property be kept under close watch. It was a political deal that made everyone unhappy, but kept everyone safe from being sued. Edmund felt the heavy weight of defeat again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just anger. It was the growing realization that there might never be justice in this case, that some truths would stay hidden, not because there wasn't enough evidence, but because the people who buried them were just better at hiding than he was at finding. Samuel stayed in the area for a few more weeks to finish up the paperwork for the inheritance that had not been claimed. During those months, he and Edmund had become friends. In their last conversations before he left, he gave the sheriff a point of view that he hadn't thought of before. Samuel suggested that the goal shouldn't be to punish the sisters, but to stop more people from becoming victims. Edmund didn't want to change his mind at first, but over time it started to make sense. Maybe he could at least change the future if he couldn't prove what happened in the past. He started quietly warning the travelers he knew, suggesting other ways to get there and telling them not to use that trail. He talked to owners of inns and taverns and asked them to tell guests about the risks of hiking alone on mountain trails. The approach was more practical than a formal condemnation, but it wasn't as good. Over time, the number of people using that trail went down. People started to stay away from that route and take longer but safer ones instead. The sisters' property, which had always relied on solitary travelers passing through, became more and more isolated, like an island of silence in the mountains. Edmund watched everything from a distance and saw how Nora and Willa reacted to the smaller number of people. They went out into the city more often now, maybe because they felt the need to show that everything was normal and fight the rumors that were spreading even though there was no proof. There was something desperate about how they acted in public. They were trying to fix their reputations that had been damaged by constant doubts. It was summer again, and the seasons had changed Edmund from a confident sheriff into a man who was obsessed and defeated. But he was still there, watching and waiting, because he knew deep down that the truth would come out eventually. He knew that secrets hidden in the ground tend to come back when you least expect them to. The change came out of the blue, like most important things do. In August 1906, a farmer who lived a few miles from the sisters' property came to Edmund's office with a strange story. He was hunting in the most remote parts of the mountains, far away from the trails the people knew about, when his dog started acting strangely, barking and digging frantically in one spot. The farmer was curious and a little worried about how the animal was acting, so he looked into it. He found something buried just below the surface of the leaves and loose dirt. It took him days to decide whether to report it or just bury it again and forget about it, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he had done. Finally, he brought his discovery to Edmund and put it on the desk in the office, his hands shaking. It was an old suitcase that had been damaged by the weather, but it was still easy to tell what it was. There were men's clothes that had started to rot, and some papers that had somehow survived, safe in a waxed envelope. Edmund looked over the papers, trying to keep his hand steady. He found a name, a date, and a business contract that mentioned a trip through the mountains. It was one of the men on his list, someone who had gone missing 2 years before. The place where the suitcase was found was very important. It was about 5 kilometers from the sister's house, but it was in a certain direction that made it look like it had been moved away from any place that could be looked into. Edmund felt something move in his chest, a mix of sadness and validation. He had been right all along, but the proof didn't make him feel better like he thought it would. Edmund took the discovery to the prosecutor right away, this time with physical proof that couldn't be ignored or easily explained. The prosecutor knew how serious the situation was and called a meeting with the judge and the same investigators who had looked into the case before. The room was tense because everyone knew that this small bag was a big change in the case. The sister's property was searched again by the investigators, this time with bigger warrants and permission to search a lot more. Edmund didn't take part directly, but he watched from a distance where he could see without getting in the way. He saw the investigators come with a bigger team, which included men who were trained to dig carefully. Nora and Willa greeted the group with their usual calmness, but this time, Edmund saw something different. Their shoulders were stiff, and there was a tension around their eyes that hadn't been there before. They knew something had changed, and they couldn't just deflect it with careful words and empty smiles anymore. The search took 3 whole days. The team looked at every part of the property, using tools that let them check the soil without having to dig it all up. They worked carefully, marking off areas that looked suspicious, and writing down every find, no matter how small. As the days went by without any important discoveries, Edmund saw the investigators' faces get more and more frustrated. But on the 3rd day, just as they were about to give up, one of the men found something at the far end of the property, close to where the thick forest started. There were thick bushes that had been left to grow wild in this part of the garden, making it look like it had been purposely neglected to keep people from exploring. Edmund saw the sudden commotion, the men rushing to that spot, and the urgent talks. He moved slowly, and his heart raced in a strange way. When he finally got to see what they had found, his legs gave out. It wasn't the explicit details that scared him. It was the final proof of everything he had suspected. The real evidence that those mountains held secrets that were much darker than most people wanted to believe. That same afternoon, the sisters were arrested. Edmund saw them being taken to the carriage that would take them to the county jail. Willa's face was completely blank as she stared straight ahead, as if none of this bothered her. For the first time, Nora let her guard down for a moment. Her eyes met Edmund's with an expression that could have been defiance or resignation, but it was hard to tell for sure. In the days that followed, the community was shocked, validated, and horrified. People who had defended the sisters felt like they had been tricked and were dumb. People who had whispered doubts felt justified, but they were also upset that they had been so close to danger without fully understanding how bad it was. The tone of conversations in the taverns changed from skeptical defense to morbid speculation. Edmund was in an odd situation. He had been proven right, and his suspicions had been proven correct. But he didn't feel the satisfaction he had expected. Instead, he felt very tired and sad about how long it had taken and how many victims could have been spared if he had acted faster, smarter, or more persuasively in his previous attempts. The prosecutor started to put together the case for trial. This was a difficult task because a lot of the evidence was circumstantial or based on inference. The purse found in the woods was very important, as were the things in the house that could be linked to certain victims. But putting together a story that made sense and was legally sound enough to lead to convictions was very hard. Samuel came back when he heard the news and offered his legal knowledge to help build the case. He and the prosecutor worked together to interview witnesses, organize evidence, and make arguments that a jury could look at and still find strong. It was very detailed work that would take months to do right. During this time, Nora and Willa were still in the county jail, but they were no longer together for the first time since they got to the area. Guards said that they stayed quiet and didn't say anything or answer questions. Willa, in particular, seemed to have completely shut down, going days without saying a word. Edmund went to see them once, but there were iron bars between them and the outside world. He didn't know exactly why he had gone or what answers he was hoping to find. Willa looked at him with the same piercing eyes that had bothered him since they first met. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but clear. She said only one thing before going back to being quiet, that the mountains had always kept secrets long before they got there, and would keep doing so long after everyone involved had been forgotten. It wasn't a confession or a denial. It was just an observation that made Edmund have more questions than answers. It was autumn again, and that meant getting ready for the trial that was coming up. The sisters' house was still empty, and it was starting to look like it had been neglected. The gray sky was reflected in the dark windows, and the garden that had once been carefully cared for was starting to be taken over by wild plants. The place seemed to know that its time was up, that the secrets it had kept for so long had finally been revealed to the harsh light of day. The trial was set for November 1906, and as the date got closer, the area became more and more tense, like a storm about to break. Welch, a small town, had never seen anything like this before. The case drew attention from all over the world, and curious people filled the inns, making it feel almost like a party, which was strange given how serious the case was going to be in court. Edmund spent his nights getting ready to testify by going over every detail of his investigations, every time he had a suspicion, and every choice he had made over the years. Samuel helped him by asking hard questions, making him question his memories, and making sure he was ready for the cross-examination that was sure to come. The sisters' defense lawyer was known for being able to break down witnesses and turn certainties into doubts through skillful questioning. The sisters hired Bartholomew Chase, a well-known lawyer from Richmond. He had a distinguished look about him, with perfectly combed gray hair and a voice that drew attention without needing to be raised. Chase had defended cases that were impossible before, and won a lot of them with tactics that were almost theatrical but worked very well. Chase went to the empty property several times in the days before the trial. He looked at every detail, took pictures from different angles, and measured distances. He was making up his own story, a different version of what happened that could make the jurors doubt what they thought they knew. During these visits, Edmund watched him from a distance, trying to guess what strategy the lawyer would use. The defense Chase was putting up was smart because it was so simple. He wouldn't deny what was found on the property, but he would try to separate those findings from Nora and Willa. He would say that the sisters were just new tenants of a house with a dark past, and that they were innocent victims of circumstances that an obsessed sheriff misinterpreted and let his suspicions change how he saw things. There were a lot of people in the courtroom on the first day of the trial. Edmund saw Nora and Willa being brought inside and noticed how much they had changed since they had been in prison for months. They were thinner and paler, but they still stood up straight, which was always a part of who they were. Willa kept staring straight ahead with a blank look on her face, while Nora's eyes moved around the room every now and then, taking in each face as if she were keeping track of who had come to see her fall. The prosecutor started his case with a detailed timeline that showed when the sisters came to the area, when the disappearances started to happen, and how the pattern of where they happened always pointed to that property. Samuel had helped plan the presentation so that even someone who didn't know much about the law could understand the logic. He built a web of circumstantial evidence that, when looked at individually, didn't seem like much, but when looked at as a whole, it painted a damning picture. One of the first witnesses was Edmund. He walked to the stand, trying to keep his legs steady, knowing that this was the moment he had been waiting for years. When the prosecutor asked him directly, he went into detail about his investigations, his notebooks, his maps, each visit to the property, and each conversation with the sisters. His voice was strong, but it was full of restrained emotion. You could hear years of frustration and determination in every word. Chase's cross-examination was very harsh. The defense lawyer picked apart every choice Edmund had made, questioning his methods and implying that his obsession had clouded his judgment. They also implied that he had become so sure of the sisters' guilt that he had started to see everything through this warped lens. Chase never gave up, but he was always polite. His voice never got louder than a normal conversation, which made his accusations even more powerful. He focused a lot on the first time they searched the garden and failed, getting Edmund to admit that he had found something one day and it had disappeared the next. Chase said that this showed that Edmund had made things up and that his need to find guilt had caused him to have false memories. Hearing his own actions described as signs of mental instability instead of a real investigation was heartbreaking. The next important witness was the farmer who found the suitcase in the woods. He was a simple man who didn't like the attention and formality of the courtroom, but you could tell he was honest. He told exactly where and how he found the suitcase, how his dog acted, and why it took him so long to tell someone. It was understandable that he was hesitant, and in a way that made his testimony more believable. His words were not planned or practiced in any way. Chase tried to say that the suitcase could have been there for decades, and that there was no way to link it to the sisters' time living there. But the papers in the suitcase had clear dates, and experts in how materials break down said that the suitcase's condition was consistent with being outside for about 2 years, not decades. The prosecution won that point, but Chase had already planted the seed of doubt about clear links. Witnesses were asked to point out things that were found in the sisters' home. The specific engraving on the cover of the pocket watch made it easy to tell what it was. The unique pattern on the ivory handle of the walking stick helped identify it. Family members gave descriptions that linked rings to certain men. Each item told a silent story about someone who had been on that property and then disappeared. The defense brought in witnesses who had bought or sold similar items in markets in the area to show that things often changed hands, and that having something didn't prove how it was gotten. Chase said that the sisters could have bought these things from traveling salespeople, and that there was no clear proof that the things had been stolen from victims instead of being bought legally. Margaret, the owner of Bramwell's boarding house, talked about the man who had stayed with her and the route he planned to take. She remembered his watch very well, and when she was given the watch in question, her hands shook as she held it. She cried on the stand, saying she was sure it was the same watch because the engravings were exactly the same as the ones the man had shown her with such pride. Chase asked her questions in a gentle but firm way, like how she could be so sure after so long, how many watches with similar recordings she had seen in her life, and if it was possible that her memory was being affected by her desire to help. Margaret stuck to her guns, but doubt had been planted, and Edmund could tell by the looks on some jurors' faces that Chase was getting what he wanted. The trial lasted for 2 full weeks, with new testimony, evidence, and arguments every day. When particularly damning evidence was presented, the mood in the courtroom went from tense to boring, as lawyers argued about technical points. The jurors looked tired, and their faces showed how hard it was for them to make a decision about something so complicated and upsetting. During the whole thing, Nora and Willa didn't say anything, which is their right. Chase had told them not to put them on the stand because he knew the prosecutor would tear them apart during cross-examination. They were quiet on purpose, but that only made people wonder more, People wanted to hear them talk and understand how two women could do what they were being accused of doing and what they were thinking. People used their imaginations to fill the void left by their voices. There were a lot of theories going around in bars and on the streets, and they kept getting more complicated. Some people said they were monsters with no humanity, while others tried to figure out why they acted the way they did by talking about imagined traumas or evil influences that might have changed their souls. Edmund had mixed feelings about what he saw. He had been able to get the sisters to go to court. He had revealed at least some of the truth that the mountains were hiding, but the process itself was frustrating. It was a complicated dance of rules and counter-arguments that sometimes seemed more concerned with legal details than with real justice. He knew that these protections were necessary and that everyone was innocent until proven guilty, but after everything he had been through, they tried his patience. Finally, the closing arguments were here. The prosecutor spoke with controlled passion to sum up the case, painting a picture of calculating predators who had turned a crossroads into a hunting ground and used isolation and hospitality as weapons. He asked the jurors to connect the dots that the circumstantial evidence clearly drew, appealing to their sense of justice. Chase responded with cold eloquence, tearing apart the prosecution's story piece by piece. He stressed that there was no direct evidence, no eyewitnesses, and the possibility of other explanations for each finding. He told the jurors that they needed more than just strong suspicions to convict someone. They needed proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He ended by asking if they really wanted to convict two women based on coincidences and the sheriff's strong desire to do so. On a cold December afternoon, the jurors went back to their rooms to think about the case. Edmund and Samuel waited outside the courtroom, smoking one cigarette after another and not being able to sit still. The hours felt like days, and every minute made people wonder what the delay could mean. A long discussion could mean that the jurors are unsure or disagreeing, which is exactly what the defense wanted. Finally, after almost 2 full days, the jurors came back. The courtroom filled up quickly, and everyone was excited to see the moment of the verdict. Edmund watched the jurors as they came in, trying to figure out what they were thinking based on their carefully blank faces. His heart was beating so fast that he could hear it in his own ears. The judge told everyone to be quiet and asked the jurors if they had made a decision. The foreman stood up and held a piece of paper in his hands that shook a little. Everyone in the room was completely silent, holding their breath for words that would be impossible to take back once they were spoken. The verdict was clear and cut through the thick air of the courtroom. Guilty. The word bounced off the wooden walls and echoed in every corner. It carried with it the weight of months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and years of secrets hidden in the mountains. Edmund's knees almost gave out, not from relief, but from finally being free of all the tiredness that had built up. Samuel put a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent way of saying he understood everything that had to happen to get there. There was no change in Nora and Willer's faces as they listened to the verdict. Willer kept looking straight ahead with the blank look she had had the whole time. Nora closed her eyes for a moment and let out a small sigh that was almost too quiet to hear. Then she got herself together again. They were taken back into custody while people in the room whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Everyone knew what the sentence would be, even though it wouldn't be read until days later. There wasn't much room for leniency because of how serious the charges were and what the crimes were supposed to be. The mountains that had kept their secrets for so long finally saw something like justice, even if it wasn't perfect and came too late for those who had already died on those trails. Edmund left the courthouse and walked through the streets of Welch. His steps felt lighter than they had in years, but it didn't feel like a victory. It was more complicated than that. It was a mix of relief and sadness. He remembered all the times along the way when he doubted himself and his suspicions seemed crazy even to him. He thought of the victims whose names he knew and those whose names he might never know. He interrupted stories that left only echoes and silent objects as proof of their existence. The land where it all happened would stay empty for a long time. No one wanted to buy that land or touch the soil that had taken in so many dark stories. Over time, the forest would start to take back the land. Trees would grow in the spot where a well-kept garden used to be, and wild plants would cover the house until it was just another forgotten ruin on the slopes of the Appalachians. For decades, people in the area would talk about Nora and Willa, making them into local legends. They were stories told on winter nights when the wind howled through the pine trees. As time went on, the details would get bigger, as they always do, and the truth would mix with the fiction until it was impossible to tell them apart. But the main point of the story would still be that danger doesn't always come with clear warnings. It can look like a normal person and offer help before showing its true colors. Edmund would stay sheriff for a few more years before finally retiring. His body and mind were tired from enforcing the law in places where civilization was still a thin layer over more primitive instincts for decades. He would move to a smaller, quieter town where he could fish in clear streams and try to forget the shadows that had been following him for so long. But some memories stay with us forever. Some pictures stay in the mind even when the eyes are closed, coming back in dreams and when the mind is free to wander. The mountains would stay the same, no matter what was going on with people on their slopes. People would use their trails for many years to come. New settlers would build homes in their valleys, and life would go on as it always does in places where nature still rules over civilization. The secrets that Nora and Willa had kept were revealed, but the mountains held many more. There were stories buried under decades of fallen leaves and melting snow, waiting for the day when they would be found. This story reminds us how easy it is to lose trust, how lonely people can be vulnerable, and how isolation can give people chances to take advantage of them. It's easy to forget how different things were when people could just disappear without leaving a digital trace in today's world, where we can talk to each other right away and everything is connected. When you traveled through the mountains, you entered a world where you were completely alone with your choices and the people you met. Nora and Willa, the Appalachian sisters, have become part of the region's dark mythology. Their names were whispered along with other stories of danger and mystery that the mountains collect like moss in a forest. Their story shows us that evil can take any form, that predators come in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest danger is hiding behind doors that offer safety from the cold night. Before he died, Edmund gave his notebooks to the county archives. They were detailed records of his obsession that had become a duty. The pages of those notebooks would turn yellow with age. The ink would fade, but still be readable. They would be a silent tribute to a man who couldn't let injustice go and who sought the truth even when it cost him almost everything. And so, this story ends not with clear answers to all the questions, but with a conclusion that gives some closure. The mountains still keep their secrets and whisper through the pines on windy nights, but some of their shadows have been brought to light. At least some of the voices that were silenced have been heard again, because someone was determined to keep listening. If you've made it this far with us on this trip through the dark mountains and the secrets they held, you might want to think about subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell and mysteries to uncover in history. Please leave a comment about what you thought of this story. We'll see you on the next trip through the dark places of the unknown.